I'm joining you from the music room in the rectory at St. Peter and Paul's, and I have with me the Annals of the parish that were compiled beginning in the mid-20s by Msgr Edward Spalding. Msgr Spalding was my predecessor, who was the pastor of Cathedral from 1888 until 1935. I've read the announcement of his death in the parish announcements from 1935, and his assistants who wrote the announcement kind of implied that they thought he was a saint. And I've heard as much from an older parishioner here who told me, my dad told me he was a saint. And so Msgr Spalding is giving us an account also of the three bishops of Alton, the Diocesan Orphanages, and other things around and about Cathedral. Now, before the Catholic Children's Home was built in the early 20s, the Diocesan Orphanage was the building that is now occupied by the Loretto Towers condominiums. It was in charge of the Precious Blood Sisters of Ruma, and after the final addition was made to the building, it housed up to 250 orphans from all parts of the diocese. So joining Msgr Spalding's account already in progress. In December 1918, an epidemic of influenza that was raging violently and with fatal results throughout the land broke out at the orphanage. It was brought there by two children whose mother had just died. As soon as the symptoms of influenza appeared in the children, they were immediately transferred elsewhere. But the germs of disease had been scattered, and soon one of the older girls and 5 boys were stricken, and 3 days later, 80 children were victims of the dread disease. This number soon increased to 108 who were prostrated at one time, causing the greatest anxiety and even consternation. The Reverend M.A. Tarrant was chaplain of the institution. Just as an aside, Msgr Tarrant was, in residence here at Cathedral for about 20 years, from about the turn of the century, went on to become the founding pastor of Blessed Sacrament Church in Springfield, and our own Father Donahoe was there in the room when he passed away in the mid to late 50s. So the Reverend M.A. Tarrant was chaplain of the institution, and under the direction of Bishop Ryan, he left nothing undone to stem the tide of the terrible disease, devoting almost his entire time, day and night, to the care of the children. As soon as they manifested any symptoms of the influenza, he would frequently carry them himself to the upper floor of the asylum, where they would be isolated as best they could from the other inmates of the building. 2 or 3 times he was suspected of having contracted the disease himself, but it was at most in a very mild form, and so God spared him for many more years of faithful service. Dr. G. Taphorn, who had looked after the welfare of the orphans during some 30 years and more, visited the asylum 3 and 4 times daily, and brought with him not only his skill and ripened experience, but his unpretentious kindness and devotion. The memory of his untiring solicitude is still treasured at the orphanage, and the recording angel of the better world has surely kept a record for a fit reward hereafter. The services of several trained nurses were secured. Amongst them were Miss Keeler, Miss Berghoff, Miss Candy, Miss Zimmer, Mrs. Manns, and others. Sister Victorine, the superioress of St. Joseph's Hospital, came twice a day in the beginning to direct the nurses and to establish a system for attending the children. It was almost impossible to isolate the children properly, owing to their large number and the cramped quarters of the institution. Not only the dormitories, but the halls and corridors were filled with the cots of the fevered little ones. The good sisters were untiring in their labors and their prayers. The epidemic raged violently for about 3 weeks, but some of the children were bedfast and helpless until the early spring of 1919. The disease was very treacherous, and elsewhere it claimed its victims by the score. But here at the orphanage, under such excellent care, only 2 cases proved fatal. He goes on to write that shortly after this, Bishop Ryan gave up the idea of adding another wing to the existing orphanage and building a whole new one, which is today the Catholic Children's Home up the street here. Bishop Ryan himself had a soft spot in his heart for the orphanage, for the orphans. He himself had been a poor immigrant from Ireland, and every morning at 6 a.m. he said Mass, and 2 of the boys from the orphanage would come over to serve his Mass. And it was only the orphan boys who had the privileges of serving his Mass, not the boys of the parish. So now that I've read this to you, I'd like to ask you to think about what it was that inspired Msgr Tarrant to go from being chaplain of the orphanage to being basically an orderly. In other words, to be so devoted to his charges that he was not only looking after their souls, but even their bodies, and at the risk of his own health. I would suggest to you that it is the spirit of prayer. And when we enter into the spirit of prayer, we put, to the best we can, we put our hearts on the same page as the heart of Jesus. And we receive from there strength in whatever trial we're up against. Whether it's the trials of Msgr Tarrant and the Precious Blood Sisters, who, as Msgr Spalding pointed out, worked and prayed, or Dr. Taphorn, who had by the time the Annals were written, had evidently already gone to his reward. And so if we fast forward to 2020, the spirit of modern medicine is great, and I've benefited from modern medicine the same as the next person. But the spirit of prayer, especially in time of crisis, the spirit of prayer is indispensable, and it was the spirit of prayer that kept Msgr Tarrant at the orphanage at all hours, doing the work of an orderly, rather than safely ensconced in the bishop's residence. That same spirit of prayer can do the same thing for us in all the acts of charity that we're called upon to do, both in extraordinary times and in ordinary times. God bless you.